Hello, everybody. Welcome to the conference. My name is Benny Rosenzweig. I'm one of the students in the inaugural class of the Political Analytics program. My particular focus in the program, so my interests are in developing machine learning techniques, using neural networks and other more modern analytical techniques, and introducing them into the political sciences in a more integrated way. And these topics are very related to this first panel, which is predicting elections in an unstable political environment. So throughout the course of this panel, you guys, there should be index cards that have been passed around. I'll be coming around to collect any questions that you have. I'll be passing them to the moderator, and so that you guys can get your questions to the panelists. So now I'd like to pass it back over to Professor Wawro, who's going to be introducing the panel. Thanks, guys.
So since this panel is about predictions, I'm going to make a prediction about Benny. In a very short amount of time, you're probably going to hear Benny's name again, because I think Benny is going to be one of the leaders when it comes to predictions, especially about elections. So you saw him here first. Okay, you could say you knew Benny before Benny was, a big star. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our panel. We're just going to go in alphabetical order here. So to my right is my dear colleague, Robert Erikson. He's professor of political science here at Columbia. For decades, Bob has been one of the most important scholars in the fields of elections, voting behavior, and public opinion. He has vastly expanded our understanding of elections, making seminal contributions across a range of questions. To Bob's right is Joe Lenski. He is the president and exit poll director for Edison Media Research. It's hard to overstate the role that Joe and Edison play in determining and understanding election outcomes. Joe's work makes it possible for us to know election outcomes before all the votes have been counted, and helps us to analyze why elections turned out the way that they did. This work is critically important for enabling the country to prepare for peaceful transitions of power. And last but not least, we have Ethan Rosen. He is the Associate General Counsel at PredictIt. Through his work, Ethan has provided a platform for facilitating research into the way markets forecast events. By enabling users of the platform to wager on election outcomes, PredictIt has pioneered new ways to aggregate information that can help overcome limitations of more traditional forecasting approaches. And critically, Ethan and PredictIt make their data available to the academic community at no cost. Welcome to you all, and thank you for taking the time to provide your unique insights into election predictions. So to start the discussion, let me ask whether or not you agree with the premise of the panel title. Is the current political environment more unstable relative to other eras? And if so, what do you see as the most important ways that it is unstable?
Should I start?
Yeah. Ethan looks eager to go over there. So.
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for everybody who helped to put this conference together. I do think that this era is more unstable than previous eras that we've lived in. A particular issue that we're dealing with that I imagine I'm going to be coming back to over and over again on this panel, given the theme, is the hyperpolarization that we're dealing with in our society, not just of worldviews, but of basic realities, like what factual realities we live in. Are things true? Those are the types of things that informs us. I'm sure a lot of people here have a relative who at Thanksgiving just goes on and on about things that they think are just simply made up. It's a difficult time because people are becoming more polarized, more bubbleized based on that. And I mean, as the last few years have shown, you just look no further than January 6th to what effects this has had on society.
But it also depends how you define stability.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stability in terms, the polarization makes a lot of this more stable because the groups are in their tribes and behave that way. But a lot of the instability comes from how close these elections are and the narrow margins in very key states that are determining the winners and losers. So if we're predicting overall margins, a lot of the polling we do is more accurate than ever, but when it's a 1 or 2 or 3 point race in a lot of states, that precision isn't going to be enough to predict the winner in a lot of cases, and that, I think, is what leads to this sense of instability in predicting the actual winners, not necessarily the percentages that each candidate is going to get.
You just took my talking points.
Oh, sorry.
but you're right. So I just read one analysis this morning online that said that the before and after comparison of averaging all the presidential polls, that maybe Biden gained a fraction of 1 point from his speech a week ago. One thing we don't know is whether the past is going to be prologue to what's going to happen in this election. In other words, we know from the past how to analyze elections from this point forward, and we're now in March. And we know a couple things from the past, and we don't know whether they're going to be true. In other words, we know from the past that early polls don't matter that much. So that typically, well, disregarding the stability we just talked about, and we know that the economy seems to matter. And then we ask, why isn't it mattering? And so those are some of the questions we could have. So that, for example, one interesting fact which people find surprising is that the economy at this time of year, even into April, doesn't seem to predict the polls at that time. So if I give you some kind of measure of economic conditions next month, comparing with the polls next month, you say that correlation is based on, let's say, 17 past elections, that's pretty weak. Doesn't matter that much. If we took the same comparison between the economic conditions at the end of the year, at election time, with the actual election results, and boy, that's a strong relationship. So typically one thing that happens is the economy kicks in, and somehow, and I'm not going to take, it's a bit of a mystery as to why and how it works, that the economic conditions play a major role, not a total role, in terms of predicting the outcome of the election. So then, how is the economy? How do you measure it, and so on? And one way of looking at it, right now everybody's thinking, well, the economy's going pretty good, although let's go see it get better and better, it's going to help Biden, right? Might not be the case. In the past, you can look at the leading economic indicators at this point to figure out what's going to happen in 6 months, because that's what's really going to affect the result. And this year, the leading indicators, last I looked, there should be a reading in late March. Maybe it was one this morning. I don't know. They're not good. They're negative, not recession. Don't say there's going to be a recession, but they're not good. On the other hand, the leading indicators past year or two, must have been wrong all the time, because forecasts of a bad economy have all been proved to be wrong. And I think the economy itself, in terms of what affects the elections, is not really kicked in yet, in the sense that, yeah, unemployment's low, but that's not the major factor. Like, obviously, inflation matters, but that's not everything either. It is basically income growth is the best objective predictor of economic predictor of elections. Income growth, obviously, adjusted for inflation. And only recently has income growth caught up with inflation. So it's not as good as you might think from watching MSNBC 24 hours a day. And so the economy seemingly is getting better. And if it stays on this course, that should be good for Biden. But then again, give you the warning signs. And then the other question is, maybe this election is unique, so everything I just said doesn't matter this time.
I want to come back to the point about how close elections are and how that has presented new challenges for forecasting and prediction. To what extent do you think forecasting and prediction might be playing into that, in the sense that the technology has gotten better in terms of our models, in terms of our data, and so how much might that be influencing the allocation of resources to make state-level races closer, races for electoral college votes closer, or races at because past presidential elections have basically been in the margin of error, like you mentioned. And so is it possible that now that we think we have a better handle on how to model, and our modeling techniques are informing resource allocation decisions, might that be feeding back into the fact that elections are much closer these days than they have been in the past?
Well, you probably have to ask the political partisan pollsters to see how good that feedback loop is. I mean, what we measure is voting on election day, or the by-mail and early voting leading up to election day. So we're measuring it at that snapshot in time. it's just been a period. I mean, you got to go back to the end of the 19th century to have a period of elections that were this close on a presidential level and swung on so few states. I mean, we know right now the 6 states that are going to determine the Electoral College outcome, and that wasn't the case when I started in this business in 1988. You know, you look at the predictors, and there weren't as many out there that were doing predictors. But if you looked in Newsweek or Time Magazine or all those ancient periodicals that no one pays attention to, they were the ones predicting the Electoral College, and you could see how wrong they were at the time. So you're right, these predictors have gotten more accurate, but at the same time, what they're trying to predict needs such precision that just the slightest error makes it look like there's no precision to it at all.
I can remember, back, you mentioned 1988, Michael Dukakis was a Democratic candidate. And the first thing he did, I think, if my memory is right, was that after the conventions was to, first campaign stop, he took, for some reason, went to Minot, North Dakota, and drew a big crowd. Now, why would a Democratic candidate go to western North Dakota as a first campaign stop? Obviously, they wouldn't do that today. We paid more attention to the states that are obviously going to be decisive. Perhaps they do that a little bit too much. Like, for example, the Democrats should worry about the big 3 industrial states that swing either from before Trump and then back to Biden. They should worry about Arizona and Georgia, which they could capture, but they should probably try to capture Florida. That's been close. This stuff beyond their grasp in the past, but you got to widen their horizons a little bit. Probably the Republicans and make a similar advice to Republicans. But we see that it's those states that matter, and Biden is behind in the battleground states now. So what does that mean? Well, some people say, well, those state polls are just bad, but maybe not. Maybe they're just as good, if not better, than the national polls. Because people do the state polls, sometimes some of them know what they're doing. Maybe it's just that the Electoral College problem for the Democrats has gotten wider. As we have a more of a rural versus urban divide in this country, the Electoral College is more important, so the Democrats really have to get 52% of the vote if they're going to win the Electoral College. Biden got 52% last time, and he barely squeaked through.
If I could just add one thing here. When we talk about the 6 states that are going to decide the 2024 election, I think we all agree on what those are. But if you look out longer term to 2026 or 2028, there are a number of other states on the board. I mean, you could talk about North Carolina is an obvious one, Ohio, Florida, even Minnesota or New Mexico. It's difficult over the longer term to forecast things that happen as the result of realignments. So right now there's data showing that there's actually realignment along racial lines going on right now. That has the potential to change election outcomes in a number of close states. And we might not see that in 2024 have a decisive effect, but if these trends continue, we will see them have a decisive effect in 2028.
I'd like to pursue that a little more. So Donald Trump has significantly remade the Republican Party. He has taken positions that have conflicted with those of the Republican establishment. How has this contributed to instability and made it more difficult to predict elections?
Well, it's a different party if you think about the personnel. Obviously, we know Mike Pence is not supporting his party, the former vice president. People like Paul Ryan, a former vice president, Romney, former vice presidential candidate. Romney, his presidential candidate, did not. I assume McCain would not if he were around. His widow is not supportive. So people from George Bush, he's not supportive, and people in Bush's cabinet, and probably some people who were in Trump's cabinet are not supportive. So you just figured, so the cast of characters is different, and so it's a very different party in terms of personnel than it was before. And people are saying that if Trump does win, the people who are around him and the people who serve in his cabinet are going to be a different crew than the ones it was last time. a group that's much more loyal, and basically people who aren't there to humor Trump and to work for typical Republican goals, but rather people who are totally on the Trump bandwagon.
But we just did 7 exit polls from Iowa to this last Tuesday in Ohio for the Republican presidential primaries. And the one question you could ask, and you could just use that to basically predict Trump vote, was the question we asked voters in the Republican primary: do you think Joe Biden was legitimately elected president in 2020? And by a 2-to-1 margin in just about every state, Republican voters said no, Joe Biden was not legitimately elected, and that group went over 90% for Trump. Haley won the much smaller group that said Joe Biden was legitimately elected. So that kind of indoctrination of the cause of Trump voters, that not only are they voting for issues like economy and immigration, whatever, but they're voting for a belief that Donald Trump did not lose in 2020, and that's the driving factor in their vote this time around. It's, again, depending on your definition of stability, it's a pretty unstable phenomenon for 2/3 of a party to think that the previous election was not legitimate. But that forms the bedrock now of Trump's appeal within the Republican Party.
And I would bet that those percentage of voters who thought the 2020, Republican voters who said the 2020 election was legitimate, also went overwhelmingly for Matt Dolan in the Senate race.
Yes.
Yeah, which is not surprising. I mean, there's polarization within the party as well.
No, there was a lot. We saw that on Tuesday. Haley voters were Matt Dolan voters.
Yes.
Moreno voters were Donald Trump voters.
Yeah, I'd like to say something which I don't, excuse me, I don't know whether it's true, but I'd like to believe it's true. And that is that a lot of these people who say that Biden did not win legitimately don't necessarily believe what they just told a pollster. But they want the pollster but they say that because they want the pollster to believe that's what people say. and there's no cost to saying it even if you don't believe it.
Well, and there is evidence that, and we have to be careful when we're doing our polls, when we're asking an opinion, is it a true opinion in that they believe it factually, or just an opinion they want to express to be part of that group? I mean, it affects our measurement in a lot of ways. Trump has so demonized by mail voting, for example, that now his voters are much more likely to vote on election day, and Democratic voters are much more likely to vote by mail. But even when we ask that question, it's exaggerated, because we can go back and check the voter rolls to see whether a person actually voted by mail or not. And more Republicans lie to us and say they voted on election day, but we go to their record and find they voted by mail, and more Democrats lie the other way, where they say they voted by mail and they voted on election day. So part of the challenge to this group here is to tease out these analytics. Just because someone told us they voted by mail doesn't mean they actually did. You have other pieces of information that you can check that information to see how much of what they're telling you is actually factually true and how much they're just saying because they think that's the socially accepted answer they should give to be part of that group.
And on that note, in Tuesday's primary, if you were watching the results, you would have seen Matt Dolan in the Ohio Senate primary come out to an early lead because Ohio counts its early votes first. So again, within the Republican Party, if you're just watching election returns, if you're not aware of this phenomenon, which I'll plug, PredictIt traders have become very good at understanding this phenomenon, you would miss out on, you would see this blue mirage or a red mirage, depending on what order the votes are counted in. This used to just be, a result of what counties or precincts were counted. Now it's a result of what type of votes are counted.
So there are 2 threads here that I think are really important to pursue. One about misinformation, and the other is about modes of voting that are available. So let's stick with misinformation for the moment. What challenges, apart from what was just discussed, does misinformation, which seems to be growing by the day, present for forecasting, apart from people telling you things that they don't really believe? Is that leaking into other things that are going to make it harder to do accurate predictions?
Well, I think part of the challenge, you were talking about the economic models, you see real partisan divides on how people perceive the economy. And when you ask more personal questions, their measure of the economy may differ from what they say in terms of the global or national amount of the economy. So I think it's measures like that are challenging our previous abilities to predict. And it's also, while they might not be truly formed opinions factually, when they're reinforced over and over again by the media and the other sources that voters are consuming, they become true opinions. I mean, even if a couple years ago you didn't believe Joe Biden was illegitimately elected, but you've just expressed that opinion, had people around you express that opinion, you've been fed that opinion, it becomes a true opinion. So I think we have to understand what the sources of information for these voters are and how they consume this, and then how they bring it, reply to us when we ask them their opinion.
Yeah, one factor I think is that Trump is a very successful salesperson. So he sells misinformation really well to the people who wouldn't believe it. And the average politician does not have that gift. If we imagine it was Ron DeSantis who just got lost in 2020 by the same amount that Trump did, can you imagine him claiming the election was stolen? Or if he did try that he would have any success in convincing anybody? In other words, just consider the importance of Trump as the factor when he's on stage.
And to that, I think when we're talking over longer term timeframes making predictions, I think it becomes more difficult. The timeframes in which polling is not necessarily as predictive as it is a couple months out. So a good example of that is, I'm sure a lot of people in this room, including myself, thought that if Trump was indicted for what he did on January 6th and leading up to it, that a larger share of Republican voters would see him as tainted and abandon him, when in reality, because a lot of Republican primary voters have a different factual universe than a lot of Democratic primary voters, they saw it as more evidence that there was a massive conspiracy out to get them, and he was the guy who stood in the way of that. So they tightened their grip around him as a result of that. And I'll say, again, as a representative of a prediction market, which tends to be more accurate in the longer term compared to polling, in the shorter term, polling it does pretty well. That worries me, because it's difficult to come up with predictions about how people will react to data when you fundamentally don't understand what they think.
And pollsters tend to ask a lot of hypothetical questions, and if you look back, the historical accuracy of people predicting how they react to things in polls does not always, not just the issue of the Trump indictments, but there's a long series of issues where you ask people in advance how they would react to something, and it's not how they end up reacting to it.
So it sounds like nobody on the panel is very enthusiastic about the ability of systematic prediction to combat misinformation. The idea basically being that, well, we are able to predict these elections with relative confidence, and therefore you should believe the actual results based on all the data and the modeling techniques that we deploy to try to understand this.
Can I bring up, there's a podcaster who's popular on what you might call the right, who I won't name, but he predicted that there would be a glorious Trump 49-state landslide in 2020. And when that, of course, did not happen, he faced zero blowback from the right for being so catastrophically wrong. Because the incentive structure in society right now, to a large degree, is not to tell people things that are true, but it's to tell people things that will, make them react in a certain way, because that's what social media algorithms promote to a large degree. So, if you have the polling average shows Biden leading by 5 points, that's not going to filter into the right-wing ecosystem. And it goes, I think, to a lesser degree, but that happens on the left as well.
So I'd like to get back to this issue of different modes of voting and the challenges that presents. So in recent elections, voters have had more options how to vote, apart from just voting on the day of the election. There's voting by mail, there's early voting prior to election day. So what sort of difficulties has this presented for turnout projections, and how turnout projections affect outcome predictions, especially considering the big differences between the voting method that partisans choose?
Yeah, I can just tell you how it's complicated the life of doing an exit poll. When exit polls were first developed by my mentor Warren Matosky in 1967, 95+% of voters voted at their local polling place on election day, and the models worked really well because you had high response rates, you had good historical tracking of how people had voted in a previous election in that precinct and how people voted in that election. You can make really good projections. In my first election was in 1988. Same way, most people were still voting on election day. You could make really good predictions based on probability samples of precincts and then random sample of voters within those precincts. Now you're playing three-dimensional chess because you not only have to make good predictions of how people vote on election day, you have to make good predictions of how people that vote early. And so we've added exit polls at early voting locations in states that have early voting in the 2 to 3 weeks before election day in person. And then we also have to measure the people that vote by mail and how they vote. And so you got to make good projections within each of those three groups, but then you also have to make very good projections of the sizes of each of those groups. So it's almost as if you're predicting 9 different elections within one election compared to how straightforward it used to be.
And how does so voting by mail might make it easier to vote, right? And so that we've had higher turnout in recent elections. How much do you think that is contributing to the way that or sort of like the instability in terms of like, well, as people get more comfortable voting by mail, we all voted by mail, those of us who voted during the pandemic, and so as people get more comfortable with that idea, with partisan issues aside, how is that going to present challenges?
I don't know if you can take the partisan issues aside. It didn't used to be the way that by-mail voting was more Democratic and election day voting was more Republican. It's the Trump demonizing of by-mail voting in 2020 that has really exacerbated those differences. I mean, California Republicans used to win governor's races in the 80s by banking a lot of by-mail vote. And now it's completely flipped. There was a recent election here in Long Island, New York CD3, where for George Santos's vacant seat in February, and the Democrats banked a big margin in the by-mail vote, and then a snowstorm hit on election day and dampened election day turnout. Now, the Democrat won by 8. They were probably going to win anyway, but if it was a much closer election, a snowstorm, when you're telling your voters to vote on election day and you get hit by a snowstorm, that can screw up your turnout operation. Right, so.
By the way, I'll mention a member of the team who helped Swazi get elected in that district will be talking on a later panel. So we can ask more details.
Did they plan the snowstorm?
We'll have to ask them about that.
Yeah, I think that part of Trump being an effective salesman is he was able to sell to the people who wanted to hear it the idea that voting by mail was somehow fraudulent, like sending in ballots for picking the all-star game in baseball or picking one of those talent contests on TV or something where it's easy to possibly to defraud. And of course, it's not like that. I think it's incumbent on people who run elections and people who study elections to tell people this is how it really works, and you know how it works if you ever voted by mail. It's not easy to cheat. It's not a cheatable procedure. It's clean, and the idea that somehow voting by mail is just sending in truckloads of ballots at 3 in the morning, that kind of story, a lot of people wanted to hear that. By the way, I can remember back in 2004, on the other side, where a lot of Democrats wanted to believe that somehow Kerry really won Ohio, and therefore he won the election. One state was pivotal in that election, and yet somehow Kerry's forces did not storm the Capitol. And
I have the scars from that election, because it was our exit poll that showed Kerry up by 3 points, and he lost by 3 points. And that's the part of the precision we're talking about. When so much is at stake on such small margins, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, when we all learn about polling and random sampling, we know a 3-point difference is well within the margin of error. But when it's the one critical state and everyone's looking at it and everyone has doubts about it, that 3-point miss caused a lot of turmoil.
I will just add that in terms of the vote methods, there are various data sources that I think do a pretty good job of cutting through this and figuring this out. So I mean, PredictIt, again, I'll just say our traders have become very good at figuring this out, but then there are others like the New York Times Needle incorporates this. Dave Wasserman tweets about, oh, well, the vote by mail in this county is 6 points more Democratic than the vote by mail in that county was 2 years ago. So these are things that you can figure out as election returns are coming in. It's just a lot harder.
And it's a lot easier for someone to take one piece of information and spin it the way they want their followers to believe it.
100%, yeah. Because, I mean, even if a county vote by mail is bluer than it was a couple of years ago, maybe fewer people voted by mail because we're not in a pandemic anymore. I mean, these are, there are still great difficulties in figuring out this puzzle.
So the Trump opposition or Trump demonizing of voting by mail, do you see that as something, as a longer-term trend? This sort of this idea that Trump has stated these positions and then they become Republican Party orthodoxy. But given the advantages of voting by mail, especially the unexpected snowstorm, do you think that, I imagine there must be a lot of Republican consultants for the party who are not at all happy that this position is sort of key. This is still part of of Trumpism. Do you think this is, eventually we'll move on from Donald Trump? Do you think this will fade away as part of what seems to be becoming orthodoxy in the Republican Party?
That's a good question of how much of what Trump espouses is permanently accepted and how much changes. I have to think, this specifically by mail, the Republican consultants know deep down they're shooting themselves in the foot. And the moment Trump isn't around to push that claim, they're going to mobilize their voters to use vote by mail.
Yeah. I'm a bit of a contrarian in thinking that voting by mail makes a big difference in the turnout or who wins. Like somehow this helps Democrats in some way. Democrats ought to say, okay, should consider saying something like saying, okay, no voting by mail for some other kind of concession the other way around, because I don't think it hurts them. That's my contrarian view on it.
Well, historically, voting by mail was, so you had the overseas votes coming in from people serving in the military, right? You had absentee ballots from snowbirds, right? But it seems like things are just fundamentally different now when it comes to voting by mail.
Well, and you have a half dozen states at least that mail everyone a ballot now. And you've seen in these primaries that states that do all by mail balloting, like Colorado and Washington, even as the campaign on the Republican side got less competitive, they held up in terms of primary turnout, and more of the states that don't mail everyone a ballot, they saw their turnouts drop, especially this past Tuesday in Ohio and Illinois. So it does affect how many people end up voting. Whether it affects the partisan divide, that's more subject to debate.
So every now and again, internet voting comes up as an option, and it's usually dismissed. Do you think that will ever come into play as basically people get more and more comfortable with these alternative modes of voting? Will that come into play, and if so, how might that differ?
Well, if the trust in by-mail voting is so low, I would assume it would be pretty easy to torpedo trust in internet voting. And the real difference is, I mean, all the stuff we do on the internet, I mean, our banking, our everything else, they need to know a lot about us to make sure it's the right person doing this stuff. That's kind of against the idea of a secret ballot. If you want your ballot to be secret, there's only so much that the internet can track you, and you're still comfortable with your ballot being secret. So I think there's a conflict there in terms of people's desire for privacy, but at the same time needing that information for the internet to prove that it's actually who's voting is casting that vote.
I have to ask the AI question. So everybody is talking about AI. It's a big issue in academia in terms of how students are doing their work, writing papers and things like that. AI has this potential to significantly change standard practices. Do you see any potential for AI for improving election forecasting?
Yeah, so when we talk about AI, one of the things that comes to mind for a lot of people is generative AI. But AI is a whole other universe, and we're at the very early stages of this. That's about assessing vast troves of data and finding patterns in it that people might not find themselves, or it might be too much work to find it. So just as an example, I don't know how many of you saw the story that LexisNexis sends your driving data and creates a score of how safe of a driver you are based on several gigabytes per hour that your car can collect on you, and then sends that to insurance companies who base rates off it. The point being that, would it terribly surprise you to find out that somebody could take your driving habits, your shopping lists, your Netflix history and things like that, and build models of not only how likely you are to vote for a certain candidate, but what type of messaging might work on you? This is all fairly speculative, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah, but in terms of prediction, all that data has to be accurate.
Yes.
And the driving data presumably is accurate. Is the public opinion data or the individual respondent data that's going to be used to be fed into these AI models accurate enough to build true knowledge? And I don't know if that's the case.
Yeah, if I had the skill to do it, I'd give a response that sounded to you like a satirical response, as if what I said came out of AI. It was a stilted response, but I don't have that skill.
We've talked about various curveballs that have been thrown your way with regard to election forecasting. Are there any curveballs that you're anticipating, or are there any curveballs that you're particularly worried about in upcoming elections?
Well, you talked earlier about election officials. One of the big results of the 2020 election was the amount of pressure that local election officials came under from both sides, but more from the Republican side. And it's to the point where a lot of election officials said, this is just not worth it. And we're going to see 25, 30, 35% of local election officials this election year being new and not having the decades of experience election officials have had in the past. And we're navigating this all the time with information we get from election officials. I'm sure you see it on election night. There's websites that still have test data up after a poll close. There's feeds that double the results because they weren't filtered correctly. And our job is not only to deliver the results that these election officials are providing us, but to be the backstop to say, no, that's not right. And hold off. And I think that's the biggest challenge to us, to say, oh, this is on the Maricopa County website. This is in the Maricopa County feed, but it doesn't look right. And we have to be the gatekeepers of that. But if we make that decision, we have to have a rationale for making that decision, or someone's going to say, well, why didn't you publish that data? What are you hiding by doing that? And I think that's our biggest challenge on an election night. There's just so much data, and even though it comes from an official source, it doesn't mean it's always officially correct.
Could you say, before we move on, could you say a few more words about how you interact with the networks on election night to tell them, here's what we're seeing in the data, or we don't believe this, or how do you interact with networks? What sort of questions do you get that you need to answer?
Well, I'm on a conference call with the decision teams from all four networks, ABC, CBS, CNN, NBC. Arnon from Fox, he's smart enough, he doesn't need me anymore, so he can do it on his own. But we are supplying them with the exit poll data, the sample precinct data, the county data. They have their own decision teams. They're making decisions on when to project, but they need to know what confidence they can have in the data that's being provided to us. So when there are issues where we think, oh, that's test data, oh, that county's doubling that vote, and that doesn't look right. Or, oh, that by-mail data is being reported as election day data, or vice versa. We're the ones that have to say, okay, your decision teams need to know there's a question about this data, we're trying to evaluate it. Don't make a decision thinking this is absolutely correct. So there's a lot of passing of that information, because their models work really well if the data is true and accurate, but they need to know not only the margins of error if the data is correct, but they also need to know the margin of error if that data has something wrong with it.
Right. Ethan, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, I just wanted to add one memory that comes to mind is the 2020 New Jersey gubernatorial election, which was much closer than I think a lot of people anticipated. One of the county data feeds, I don't know if you remember this, was a webcam link to a webcam pointed at a computer screen that was you couldn't read it because it was just glare on a computer screen, and that's how they were reporting their results, which did not make forecasting that result very easy.
So I'd like to ask a question that's program related. So as director of this program, I'm going to ask you, what should a program like political analytics be doing to improve the quality of predictions?
So as somebody representing a prediction market, I'll pitch that I think prediction markets are a great way to do this because, I mean, there's a lot of data to pore over that I'm sure, have no doubt, people here are very adept at poring over. But when you're synthesizing how subjective variables, like how people will respond to a debate, are going to influence an election, it might be useful to have people who are hearkening back not to what the data shows them, but what they believe people who they know who maybe live in rural Wisconsin are going to emotionally react, how they're going to emotionally react. I think it's useful for people to be able to bring in their subjective interpretations of events and make predictions based on that you could then quantize.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a different game. We're not predicting weeks or months out. We're trying to predict on election night itself. And to me, the point I was just making, knowing the quality and accuracy of the data you're using and how it was collected, how reliable it is, that, I mean, you can have all the fancy models, but if the data you're putting into it hasn't been cleaned, hasn't been scrubbed, hasn't been verified, your models, your predictive models aren't going to work.
Yeah, I think that if we're trying to, going even farther back at times, like for example, this point of the campaign year, like in March of the election year, trying to predict the future, what could be, there's a lot we don't know based on the past. Predicting the past elections from the economy in March or from the polls in March, it's not that easy. We should be aware that is the case. As the election approaches, prediction, however, comes very fast. So that I think it's true that since 1952, no presidential election has a popular vote winner been behind after in immediate polls after the last convention. So whoever's ahead after the last convention, after the Democratic convention wraps up, that person is probably going to win the popular vote. Notice I did say the popular vote, and so based on the past, and so what's happening between now and then, March and September, this is the period when things evolve, and we try to figure out what's happening now, what's about to happen, to affect people's choices then.
I think we're going to take some questions from the audience. Benny has collected some. Benny, would you like to share the questions with us?
Sure. So I have some questions for myself first. And, so we're going to be, if anybody has questions that they've written down on their index cards, somebody will be coming around to collect them in the back. And if you need index cards, I believe that raise your hand, somebody will pass one out to you. But we should have this over the course of time. So yeah, I have a couple questions first. So first, just sticking on the topic of the prediction markets, since we have so we've known for a while that prediction markets are decent are pretty good predictors of election outcomes, or at least follow polls decently well. So I'm interested in how each of you would process something like the 2022 midterms, where basically all of the election prediction markets were off by over 50 points, even like a couple days out from the elections, or a few of them were for a couple states. I'm interested in how you guys interpret that personally, and how you imagine future integrations of these markets in terms of election prediction.
Well, wait, I'm not. I have to dispute the idea that they were off by 50 points. I don't think that's. No. PredictIt generally, saw exactly what the polls saw prior to, in the days leading up to the 2022 election, which was that it was likely to be a very close race across the board. Republicans were generally favored to win the House and Senate. They did win the House. They did not win the Senate. But if I could just go back to the idea that they follow the polls, which is sometimes true. Polls are definitely one of the biggest sources of information for predicted markets, but they also sometimes lead them. So in the 2022 election, you may recall Herschel Walker, the Republican candidate for Senate in Georgia, was hit by a series of articles pointing out that he, I don't want to get into it, but he had a kind of lurid scandal. It took a long time for that to filter into polling. Versus on prediction markets, every time, I think it was the Daily Beast dropped another story, he would crash down another few points on PredictIt. Because people were anticipating that even though that story had not made it into the psyche of voters in Georgia yet, it would eventually make it in, and that is what happened.
I am curious, though. It does seem, especially right up to Election Day and even on election night, there are pretty wild swings in the predictive market depending on what information is available.
Yeah, of course there can be. Part of that is that there are blue shifts and red mirage, as what people call based on vote data, which people have sometimes been better at than others. I think in recent years, our traders have gotten better at that. In 2020, I think maybe there was some of the red shifts based on early votes being counted first were taken more seriously. But another thing I'd say is you're talking about probabilities, not how much you think somebody's going to win by. So if somebody's up by 70-30, that doesn't mean they're going to get 70% of the vote share. That means there's 70% likelihood to win, which is not a very high percentage, all things considered. If you told me that I had a 7 in 10 chance of any given thing happen, that's good, but it's not great.
Yeah, and this is where what we do on election night is different from what you're doing leading up to election. We don't make that projection call. We don't put that check mark in until traditionally we would always say 99.5% probability. We're even higher than that now because we can't even live with the consequences of being wrong 1 out of 200 times. We can't even live with all that's going on right now, the probability of being wrong in any race that we're covering. And we're going to be covering nearly 1,000 elections on November 5th. So we're working on a much different level of predictive confidence than you are when you're just saying it's a 70-30 chance. To us, that means we need more data. To you, it's a way to predict what the market is saying.
Well, can I just clarify something? Which is that if PredictIt says that something has a 70% chance, that doesn't mean that we're saying it has a It means our user, the money is betting that there's a 70-30 chance. So the consequence of getting wrong is that you lose money. Which tends to make people think a little bit more about what they're doing. Sometimes it doesn't. But in aggregate,
the consequences for our clients of being wrong means the presidents of their network are called to Congress and forced to testify on what went wrong. So.
One thing I can say about prediction markets is if you want to make money at political prediction markets, bet on favorites, assuming there is a strong favorite in the market. And that is because people overvalue underdogs. So I make the same prediction if you're betting on horses or dogs. But basically bet on the favorites because people overestimate the possibility overestimate the chances of underdogs in the campaigns. This means people tend to overestimate the chance that something big is going to happen. If something big going to happen to overturn things is less likely than you think.
Oh, and we definitely have users, and our data shows this, who their strategy is to buy 90+% probability contracts.
Yeah.
The downside of that is if you lose one, you lose a lot.
Yeah,
But you can pick up pennies that way, as they say.
So we have a number of really interesting questions, and unfortunately, we won't be able to get to them all. I'll start with this one. How do you factor in the impact of micro-targeting and party organization? And it seems like micro-targeting efforts are always evolving, and how does that relate to what we can expect to happen in elections?
Yeah, I mean, with the tools we have, it's really hard to measure because we're doing national and statewide surveys. And our sample sizes aren't big enough a lot of times to pick up these micro-targeted groups. So I don't have a good answer for that because our tools aren't there to measure that.
Ethan, do you think that gets factored into any of the betting decisions that your users are making in terms of like, oh, they seem to have a really good micro-targeting effort underway, a particular campaign, and that's going to really carry the day for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of many, many data sources that people use to make predictions. It's hard to say that's the biggest one because I think sometimes there are news stories that people take into account that, so-and-so's ground game is really good and so-and-so's ground game is really weak, and that does impact people's perceptions of likelihood to win. I would just say that at a national level, when we're talking about presidential elections or Senate elections, which are state level, but I think there's generally an assumption that both campaigns in competitive elections are going to be at least pretty good at it. So I don't know how much our users take that into account.
Here's a question. So I'll ask this question because we're at a university and there are undergraduate students present in the audience. How impactful are undergraduate student populations in predicting elections, and how do changes in this population possibly promote or reduce instability?
So I was looking at some polling just this morning that on the Middle East crisis issue showed that when you look at divides over how people perceive what's going on, it's not actually based as much on partisan lines right now as it is based on generational lines. So I think when we talk about how undergraduates and their age cohorts are likely to both perceive how other people will react to news and how other people will perceive how they react to news, I think that generational divide creates a real problem. I mean, I think that there's sharp divisions in ages, and this goes back to how people get their news, whether it's from cable news, which younger people typically don't watch, or social media, which younger people do generally engage in. And then I think, I'm sure you guys can speak to this, there's at least some evidence that younger people are difficult to poll right now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And difficult to poll by various methods.
Yeah.
I think a lot of what you're seeing in terms of the differences in polling by younger voters is difference in mode of interviewing. And I think telephone especially has a really, really tough time getting 18 to 29-year-olds. And online has a better time contacting these folks, but they don't always know that they're getting the people they think they're talking to. So I think there's drawbacks in both methods, and I think that's why you're seeing so much noise in the polling among 18 to 29-year-olds right now.
Is there a way to reach them through TikTok? Bob, you wanted to say something?
Oh, no, go ahead.
So this is sort of a related question. Could you elaborate more on how much the media is contributing to close elections? And so we talked about the different sources. We have cable news, 24/7. What do you think that is? Or what role is that playing in the closeness of elections?
Well, I can tell you that there is much more interest in closer elections, and ratings go up when they're in closer elections. I mean, you look at the TV ratings for Super Tuesday, and I don't think any of the networks were happy with how few people actually watched the non-competitive elections on Super Tuesday. So, but I don't think that comes into play in terms of the editorial decisions. But the networks do appreciate competitive elections when it comes to increasing their viewership.
On the other hand, if I think somebody's going to win, they might give that side a little extra edge in the presentation, not because they like landslides, but because they have better access after the election.
So Bob, this question I think may be best addressed to you. So there's a lot of evidence that foreign policy doesn't play much of a role in voting decisions in American politics. But this election is going to be held at a time when there are significant conflicts around the world in a way that we haven't really seen recently, basically since post-Iraq war. So in terms of Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, what do you think that's going to do? What impact do you think that's going to have on the 2024 election and how we might forecast
So
it?
I'm a political scientist, and so political science is to study elections. Generally say foreign policy doesn't matter that much, but that means that only if things are quiet, right? And so I think that that sure foreign policy can matter. So if a president is prosecuting a war that's been going on a long time and they're losing in some faraway place, that's going to hurt them, right? They have had a big victory, maybe that would help. Obviously, foreign policy has electoral consequences throughout history. Back in the 1930s, Chamberlain had a foreign policy following the Munich conference, and that affected his in Britain, and that brought Churchill to power and changed the world. That was not an electoral change. But we can see that Eisenhower was elected in part because he ended the Korean War. Nixon was elected in part because of the Vietnam War. And so obviously those mattered. Trump is claiming that if he were president, then there wouldn't be things would be quiet in the Ukraine and in the Middle East, sure. And some people will respond to that. So obviously I think that foreign policy can matter, but probably in ways that I can't predict how it will matter, though.
Right. So one thing that's been in the media some has been populations in Minnesota and how that is cutting into support for Biden given the way he has stood behind Israel at this moment. Do any of you have any thoughts about?
You mean Michigan?
Michigan.
Well, Minnesota as well.
Yeah.
And we saw in the recent primaries there significant vote shares. I think it was 15% in both, around 15% in both states, with much higher, including over 50% in some heavily Muslim areas, Muslim and Arab, went for ballot choices like non-committed or Marianne Williamson, who I assume is kind of a throwaway line for a lot of people, just a protest vote. Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about Michigan or, I mean, when you're talking about very close elections, populations in the tens or even hundreds of thousands who have suddenly shifted because of an event going on, that can make a huge difference. I mean, will the Muslim and Arab population of Dearborn, Michigan vote for Trump? Maybe not, but they voted heavily for Biden in 2020, and if they can't back him, that's a real problem for the Biden campaign.
Joe, so you said quality of data is extremely important. Do you have any concerns about cyber attacks, maybe Russian meddling when it comes to reporting of election results and what's coming into your shop?
Well, security is a huge issue for our data. And so we're always monitoring sources. We're monitoring everyone's logins. All our data is embargoed. All our exit poll data is embargoed till 5 o'clock on election day, and only a small number of people can even review that data before 5 o'clock on election day. So it's a real concern, but I don't see the concern as meddling with the data, as more just wanting to gum up the works and shut down the data. I mean, we've done a little work in international elections, and whenever we are doing an exit poll in a foreign country, we always make sure we get the data out of the country so it can't be bottlenecked, because the internet in a lot of these countries can be shut down. So it's more. I'd be more worried on election day about some internet shutdown or some failure of AWS or any other hosting device on election day than actual tampering with the vote data.
So in terms of the performance of predicted models, where does the value really lie in terms of marginal increases in predictive accuracy? And so in terms of prioritizing where our focus is, given what we've talked about in terms of the closeness of elections, how important is these sort of marginal increases in predictive accuracy? And do you think we'll be able to come up with better models and better data in order to tackle this very, very thorny issue?
Well, it probably depends on what what place in the time cycle we're talking about, right? So we're talking about in March, predicting. If we want to know who's going to win in November, obviously there could be. If we knew what those were, we'd be doing them. I'm not sure what we would be doing differently. Obviously, in terms of polling, we're always looking for the mistakes in the last poll and correcting them, right? So those are the kinds of things we ordinarily do.
I think there's two tasks here. One is to make the predictions more accurate, but also I think the bigger task is to convey the precision or lack of precision or how much precision each prediction has. And I think that's as valuable a function that these models can have than actually predicting the actual outcome is predicting what the margins for error are truly in any of the data we produce.
Do you think there's been any improvement about how your average citizen understands uncertainty? I mean, it seems like reporting on elections has become so data-driven, and the horse race aspect of it is such a key focus. But any forecasting model has uncertainty. Any data analysis involves uncertainty. And my sense is that your average person does not understand questions of variance and uncertainty very well. We have point predictions reported all the time, but even nowadays, you often don't see like plus or minus 3% when polling data is reported. Do you think we've made any advances in terms of how, given that media reporting on politics has become so data-driven, do you think there have been any advances that to help people better understand what's going on behind the results that are reported, and what might we do to clarify that basically, look, these are predictions. There's uncertainty. It's not truth.
Well, I'll just talk about our clients on election night. I think they do a really good job now. We spend as much time going into 2020 trying to prepare everyone for how votes were going to be reported. Florida was going to report quickly, and Michigan and Pennsylvania were going to report slowly, and some states were going to report their by-mail ballots first, and some states were going to report their election. And at least communicating that to our clients, and I think they did a really good job on election night in 2020 and 22, communicating what they are seeing, how much of it represents the full electorate and how much represents just the different parts that are reporting early or later. I think that's the best we can do when we're reporting election results on election night.
I can remember back in 2016 when Trump had an upset victory. A lot of people were upset with Nate Silver for predicting that Hillary was going to win, and he said, "But I gave Hillary only a 70% chance. What about the other 30%?" And people did not understand. Like, it's basically a 2-to-1. Probably going to be Hillary, but maybe not.
Yeah, I would just agree with that across the board. I think that definitely if you watch cable news, some of it has gotten quite good at reporting this. I think other times when you watch people try and take apart a poll, conducted months in advance, or pick apart crosstabs, they're doing that because the poll shows something they don't like, and they want to tell you it's not true. So I think this varies a lot on who's presenting the data.
Well, we're at time for the panel. I want to say huge thanks to our panelists for coming. I hope you found this as insightful as I did. Really grateful for taking the time and for helping us better understand what's going on with predicting elections. How about a round of applause?